today, and I'm delighted to welcome all the presenters. We have the representatives from CMS In Touch, Kat and Arturo. They'll be up first in a moment, and then we have Jess Adams calling in from London and giving some insight into what it means to meet the Queen. And finally, Eva Hubeckers, who'll be talking about activism and forest dialogues. So as usual, we're going to be having 15 minutes presentation followed by 15 minutes questions. And yeah, we'll be done by about 3:45 before we'll take a quick break and back for the closing panel at 4 p.m. So as you already know, the session will be recorded. Everyone will be great if you could turn off your mics for the duration of the presentations. When we move to the questions, just raise your hand or make a comment in chat and I'll try and share as best I can. So I think that's all the formalities out of the way. As for myself, my name is Nick. I'm a member of the editorial collective of Ephemera. And yeah, I'm going to be keeping track of time and I'll give you a signal when you have 3 minutes to go. Okay, I think that's about it. So let me hand over to our first speakers, Kat and Arturo. Take it away, guys.
Thank you. I'm just going to share some slides if that's okay. Nick, let me just get them up.
Yeah.
Ephemera presentation, there we go. Okay. Can you see them?
Yes, we can see them.
Cool. Okay, that's perfect. Let me just go from the beginning. Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. Myself and Arturo are here today representing Ozan, Vegeta, and Alex, who are part of the CMS In Touch team. And we're going to kind of it's a very much work in progress paper on looking at the possibilities and challenges of getting in touch with virtual academic activism. And this is really based on our experiences of CMS In Touch. I'm going to just start by handing over to Arturo, if that's okay, Arturo. We haven't organised this, but are you okay just to kind of talk a bit about? Oh, have I changed this? There. About what CMS In Touch is, Arturo.
Okay, I'll very quickly in a nutshell. CMS is a participative platform that is run by a group of activists that is at the same time volunteers. We came together at the beginning of the pandemic as we realized that there was no possibility for people to come attend conferences, and there were issues for early career scholars, people who will depend on having the ability to connect with others to share their ideas, both for resumes and career promotions, as well as for idea development. So we, with the help of the group, we got a sponsoring name by the journal organizations and the CMS division. And we Frankenstein a set of freeware technologies, institutional resources available to us. And we create a system that allows to share on real-time ideas around the world, engage in conversations, and as well as took it to the next level into the 21st century as we plug it into the ability to bring and share spaces and virtual realities as they has not been able before. For example, in one of the workshops, we even have dance studios, videos, and music that were complementing the nature of the presentation that has not been able to be done before. Over the parts of the year, we have held 17 events in 2 categories. We have webinars that they are akin to what we are living today, a group of people presenting an idea, as well as workshops with journals that they engage people to bring creative ideas, critical ideas as part of the journal. Also, it's important to notice that this effort of the conference has an archival system. So all these conferences, webinars, and events are as well put aside on a YouTube channel. And we have noticed that many of the sessions that we have had have more views online after the event than they have had at the event. And we have as well been contacted by people just saying that they are using this material as part of a classroom or discussions. So something that started as a response to support through the pandemic has taken a life on their own. We have a social media platform. We have webinars, seminars, and we're as well using this to create on real-time engagements. For example, when news, comments, or collectives come on Twitter, social media, we use that as a hook to get people engaged in a conversation on social media. And oftentimes these social media conversations evolve into webinars, presentations, that then they are digital paper, that they are video based, that they become archived on YouTube. Kat, your take.
Lovely. So the reason that we decided to kind of frame this as virtual academic activism, and we did that really kind of annoying CMS thing by putting a question mark at the end of it, because it is of course contested whether this is activism or whether it's something else. But I think what really drove all of us was the idea of kind of recognising connecting as a cause, and that this cause was of course political and also unevenly distributed. So we were very aware right from the beginning that the parameters that we were working within were unfairly distributed, for example, in terms of digital access, but also in terms of access to time and resources that were really unevenly distributed and probably exacerbated through COVID-19 that others have talked about in a far more erudite way than we can. But the way that we did start from this, thinking about the stream that we're in just now in terms of technology, is by using Miller and Slater's idea of the online is very embedded in the world, so that we don't have kind of this idea of a separation between physical and virtual, but of course there's this kind of intermingling that happens. And this, of course, this kind of intermingling in terms of virtual academic activism or whatever we were doing vis-a-vis the other activities and practices that we engage with as a CMS community could be distributed or conceptualized a number of ways. So, for example, we might see this as kind of being a corollary where it kind of fits almost kind of in parallel to what happens physically, or in real life, as the kids in the street call it these days. But we actually wanted to do something different. We wanted to not just replicate what was happening in conference spaces, but actually try and think about this as being a bit more distributed and a bit more integrated and hopefully inclusive, the fault lines of which we'll talk about later on, is doing something different within the CMS community that was above and beyond what happened in those other academic spaces, such as conferences that we weren't able to participate in, and some are not able to participate in at all at other points. There's also the other aspects that we thought about, and one of these relational aspects was as a foil. So what we saw was that CMS in Touch was almost kind of like that kind of that foil through which we could render visible some of the problematics that happen in academic settings prior to the world being pushed online in the CMS community, but also in business schools more broadly, and think about how we might be able to render visible some of those ideas of inclusion and access, but also hopefully try and make those conversations and voices a bit more open and plural. And then I guess the third aspect that we were thinking about in terms of this virtual connecting as a cause was the idea of indexing. So what we were trying to achieve in CMS in Touch, what were we kind of indexing in terms of how we think about hierarchy, how we think about voice, how we think about participation in those communities that we see ourselves part of. But in all these aspects, I think what we saw is that we were faulty and exclusive by our definition. And what we were going to kind of talk about now were just some of the three aspects where our achievements and the things that we wanted to do, our desires to do something different, were in part successful, but also revealed some of the challenges that we faced. So I'll quickly go over what kind of data and speech marks we used for this, and I've just referred to it as retrospective reflecting. And really there was kind of two forms of data. One was the Slack channel archive. So to communicate between the group of us, we used the Slack, which is kind of like a live updating system. I'm sure Arturo could probably discuss it more kind of more eruditely. But what we did is we decided to keep all the discussion on Slack to kind of keep us away from our inboxes, which were suffering a hammering at that time because, of course, a majority of us were all flipping our teaching online. So trying to keep it set in a separate space. And that was, we've got an archive of that since May the 15th, 2021. And then we also, the current members, we undertook some auto-ethnographic reflections about what we were trying to achieve and what some of the challenges were. And what we kind of wanted to focus on here, what were some of the dynamics of activism or virtual activism that both circulated around and constituted what we see as CMS in touch. Is there anything else that we want to mention there, Arturo? I can't see you because of your screen, but I know you're out there somewhere. Is there anything you else want to kind of mention there? No, I can't even see if you're like giving me a nods up or like a thumbs down or anything. I can't see anyone on the screen. Is that okay?
Oh, yes, that's okay.
Okay. Okay. So the first one, and Arturo, I'm going to give you, because I can't see you, which is really disconcerting. I'm going to say at the end if you want to say anything about each of these three themes. So as I said, the first one we want to talk about is the idea of accountability without ownership. And I'm sure those of you that are familiar with Ephemera are very kind of aware of this idea of a self-managed collective. So as an ethos, but also as a practice, how does that practically take place? And that's the kind of sentiment that we wanted here. So when we actually started, we really aimed to be almost a catalyst for events. So as I said, providing the opportunity and the labour to put on these events, rather than take a kind of curator role. However, what happened was there was a number of kind of incidences that emerged surrounding some problematics of inclusive voices or panels that were perhaps weren't representative of the community that we wanted to be representative of, that rendered visible that this was actually quite a difficult position. So what happened is, as it developed, and despite our desire to be almost this kind of stepping back medium, we actually found that we became more editorial. And this actually, by editorial, what I mean was if people came to us with their suggested workshops, we would perhaps suggest other people that they might want to connect with. We would offer to connect people to come together for events. We would proactively reach out to different members of the community to bring them together and say, would you like to do something? And I think what this revealed was kind of quite contrasting identifications within the team. So some of us actually felt quite comfortable doing this, saw it as almost a networking service we were providing. Others felt that this could be quite problematic in terms of where we're just reproducing our dominant voices and our dominant networks as well. And in this kind of accountability without no ownership, there was almost this kind of really heavy pendulum between idealism and really a kind of pragmatism. So we all knew we had a desire that we wanted to connect people and we wanted to do it in a more inclusive way. But on the other hand, we also had a lot of other things we wanted to do, and we wanted to make sure that when people came together and gave their time to either participate in an event or to watch an event, that it was a quality event that was also an inclusive event. So, for example, one feature of this was wanting to go beyond what we might see as crowd drawers, so big names within the field, but also recognising that these were the people that often would gain more registrations and more people attending. So trying to balance up a plurality of those voices where we feature those people, but we also make sure that there are others also involved in those events as well. Is there anything else there that you'd like to talk about, Arturo?
Yes, and I want to just add a couple of quick points. Something that was important is how the transition went from we are a channel into we need to curate some of the content through the channel. That was a struggle internal within the group where we were taking ownership of our actions. So we moved from this is the tool, let others use the tool, into we own the tool. And we have kind of like a panopticon view where we are capable of seeing things that others are not because we're inside the machine. So that helped us to craft some of the argument that we were doing. And as we were being a self-managed collective, we started to realize that we were having different levels of skills that they were to be put at the different levels of need. And that was something that came natural, but at the same time, it was some requirement of coordination because some tasks became duplicated and we had to become conscious of time zones because the other thing is that we became part of a global tool. There is a difference between we're in a room and everybody has a journal or everybody has a paper that will come out in 6 months versus we are responding on real time to all time zones. So even within our team, the reason why we're using this technology of Slack was because it allows us to archive, sequence, and follow information through time, topics, and moments. So we create collective identities where we handle one single email account where everybody can access. We have a collective identity when we have one channel of social media where while everybody can access, we have responsibles on duty at the moment and task. So that's how we came from a tool into an editorial. And the danger of becoming visible versus invisible, it was something that was at the same time linked to our academic capital. Some of us are more visible than others, and being in this space, both for us, the people who's using the tools versus the people who is managing the tool became a challenge because this was something that we tried to put the spotlight on the tool and the people using the tool and not on the celebrities using the tool or the voices behind the tool.
Just to let you know, guys, you've got about 2 or 3 minutes of presentation time left.
Yeah, I've got that. Perfect. Thanks so much. So, so I guess Arturo kind of mentioned a lot of these kind of second, the second aspect in terms of some of the fault lines of inclusion. And I think what we were trying to do was with CMS in Touch, trying to, on this global platform, as Arturo mentioned, trying to effectively lift the labour of representation and voice. So make sure that we were actually doing just not only the kind of the ideological labour of promoting, but also the physical labour of the logistics of organising registrations and all those kind of under the bonnet things of organising a webinar, so that we could perhaps think about a better plurality of voices. But what we were very aware of a lot of the time was that we were simply redrawing rather than necessarily challenging or breaking boundaries in this. And I think in the autoethnographies, what really came up was that we were very much still felt in a position of harm. As I mentioned, we had a field webinar where the community felt that we hadn't necessarily curated the panel enough to be representative. But more internally, we also have almost, you can see it as a kind of invisible list, where when we see a panel, we want to make sure that they're representative. But how do we balance that between inclusion and tokenism? And that's something that we've been very, very aware of. And then also the kind of dangers here in terms of kind of reappropriating what we're trying to do into our own academic capital. So making sure that we aren't kind of platforming ourselves or promoting ourselves over and above those that we feel should be promoted and doing excellent work out there. And I'm going to really quickly jump on so we can get to the inclusion. Sorry, Arturo, please interrupt me if I forget something. And then I guess this kind of fits this idea of just, it's really important to note that this kind of virtual initiative was created in a time when actually there was a huge groundswell of wanting to do something. And I've put this as a kind of global north desire, not to detract from the fact that everyone felt this, but actually it was very much kind of the idea of, in the global north at least, that people wanting to help in some way. That had some problematic undertones. And what we were aware of is trying to decenter this privilege, but still practicing self-care. And one way was that, we've managed to achieve some fantastic friendships in the group, the organising committee, of people who we haven't actually met in person before. But more importantly, I think, is the idea of thinking about the life course of virtual activism, because I think in the past year, CMS in Touch has evolved. It might have moved into something else, or will it need to be retired at some point? And will there be enough momentum for it when we're not needed? And I think for us, an ongoing question is kind of what are the limits of the possibility in terms of our manners, also done, and can it be handed over to a mantle of someone else? So very quickly, because I think I've got 46 seconds left, where are we actually going with this? Well, when we brought together all the kind of the reflections and what had happened on Slack, what really spoke to us was this idea of the politics of loneliness, which of course has been discussed by a number of individuals. And Rent in 1953 in her work on totalitarianism talks about the idea that, isolating men are powerless by definition, and is that this loneliness can be riddles, especially in countries where had other multiple onslaughts into the academic voice and the community tiller. And understanding it as part of trying to counter this politics of loneliness was really important to us, and making sure that we could articulate that isolation and loneliness in some way. But hopefully, and I'll kind of close on this, is that thinking about this loneliness is not just something that can be isolating, but also allowing this loneliness to come together in our loneliness and actually do something creatively. And I think Ling in our 2016 book on The Lonely City really sums this up, because she talks about this idea of the nurturing this potential for loneliness to be creative if we can recognise our inherent relationality within a community. And what we would actually hope in CMS In Touch is that we've faultily tried to negotiate this both for the community, but also for ourselves as 5 people just coming together to try and do something. And I'll finish there, if that's okay. I hope I haven't gone over too much, Nick.
Thanks so much, guys. Well, you went over just a little bit, so but it was a fascinating presentation about some of the difficulties, complexities, and tensions that you face as a kind of self-organizing collective. And it's something that, of course, the Ephemera collective also recognizes, how to balance pragmatic issues around just getting the work done with more ideological principles about ensuring one's commitment to the kind of political goals that drive your project in the first place. So that resonated very much with some of our concerns as a collective. So we have some minutes for questions. I'm going to keep them to 10 minutes since we ran a little bit over, but hopefully we can continue some of the discussions that Kat and Arturo initiated. Well, maybe I can ask one just to kind of get the ball rolling. You mentioned that one of the events that you organized, you called it a failed webinar. And I think we've all experienced these occasions where perhaps you don't get something quite right, or you get some negative feedback, and that causes you to reflect on perhaps what you can do better. So I wondered, what kind of lessons did you take away from this failed webinar, and in particular, how do you think you can balance this tension that you mentioned between inclusion and tokenism? So what were the main takeaways for you from this?
Do you want Ozan and Arturo?
Kat, your connection is a little bit unstable, so perhaps Ozan and Arturo can take this.
Arturo? Ozan, do you want to take that question? Because I spoke quite a lot there. So
yes, very quickly, the difference on the tokenism is that, for example, in my case, I'm an Hispanic male, so but physically I come across as a white. So when I get into the front, people sometimes get this different idea, and we have to think in terms of the topic that we want to present versus who's the best voice to present the topic. Are we speaking from the top down? Are we speaking sideways? And the other is like, is this topic relevant to the group that is being engaged, or is this topic being condescending, to call it somehow, to the group that is meant to be engaged? And in this seminar, that was the problem that we have. Like, the experts to the topic, the people who came up and spoke up about addressing the topic, were all within certain category and certain group. And because of that, people felt this to be a colonial imposition on the topic, and we have to cancel the event just because the topic was adequate, the framework was adequate, the people engaged in the topic were not.
Just want to add that actually we are not independent of the ongoing discussions, both in critical circles, critical management studies, and other circles of the academia. All the inequalities, privileges, all these kind of problems are also embedded into our practices to some extent, despite our best intentions. So we kind of faced with that. That was a bit challenging from our end. Just want to add that in addition to what Arturo said.
All right. I see, Justina, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you for an amazing presentation and for all the work you have done with this. It's a really sort of open question and coming very much, as Nick has already sort of revealed, from all our struggles, also in Ephemera, that I wanted to ask you how you think about care. And care can be sort of for the community that you are trying to do something for, but also care internally in, you know, and also the speakers and other people involved, that sort of we are in these difficult times, we are all under so much pressure. And these sort of community things are often the extra tasks everyone is doing. And yeah, so it's really sort of an open question of what is care, sort of with your closest peers and collaborators, but also to the community. Whether you had any sort of discussions on that.
Well, you want to? I can add a little bit of it, and I think Kat as well. When we talk about care, we are looking at two levels of care. How do we care for the community? Because something that is very important, and I think that we need to be very intentional in the language that we use, because words have meaning and they create concepts. We try to do this for the community, but it's important that we are doing this with the community as part of the community. The moment that we consider ourselves doing it for the community, we step ourselves in a position of power sometimes, and we forget that we are just a channel. So that is one element. The other is about, in the sense of care, we, at least on my personal space, I think of myself as a channel, a shepherd, and sometimes I struggle myself on what is the care for the community, as in the people that we try to serve and work with, the care within the InTouch team, how do we support each other? We have different challenges because we are at different institutions, we're at different points in our careers, and how do we care about ourselves at home? Because this is something that we're doing above and beyond and may not have the full recognition of a well-established initiative. So if you write this down on a cynical way, and within the group, I'm known to have sometimes these cynical, dark comments. If I write on when we started this project, if I were to write on my curriculum for promotion, member of the care team has no value. But if I look at the number of hours that it was demanding from me, has a high value. So being able to coordinate my self-care to survive to the next level, to find the collective value, was one point. Working with the group so we can support each other, that was a second level of care. And working with the community, that was as well linked to the previous question about the pitfalls of representation and colonialism, global north and south, was the third level of care.
Thanks.
I think, were you unmuted to say something? Did you want to say something, or was that no?
No. I was wondering about actually what you will say, but your sound comes and goes.
Oh, you go. Well, I was just going to say that I think that's a really good question. Can you hear me, Justine? I'm just going to do that thing where if you can't hear me, I'll just talk louder, because that'll clearly help the internet connection. So I think that's actually a really good question, and because I think what you do, like when you offer up your labour to do so, why are you doing it, and what are the honest intentions of doing it? And I think one of the things that was very clear is that when you do that, you've got to be aware that you've got to put in those practices of self-care within the group, because the community might not feel that what you're doing is as fantastic as you think you're doing in your head, right? So you have all these romantic visions. So I think what I think we were very good at very early on, and I think this came quite organically, was kind of creating a little bubble of the group that was very high trust, very confidential, and we were able to kind of just use that as a way of just decompressing or finding ways to work through things. Because I think one of the things is that when you put yourself on, when you present your labour to a community, it doesn't mean that it's going to be this one-way flow of love back, and it shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be, because we're like, you know, you're in that position of accountability. But I think it is so important how you kind of how you choreograph those ways that you respond externally through a kind of little internal bubble. So I don't know if that's I don't know if that articulates it, but I guess that's what was really, really important for us. So what little things like I made sure that when we got an email that perhaps wasn't as forthright, you make sure that it's a consultative response, and that in itself is not just because you're a collective, but actually that that's the best way to do it, to make sure that something doesn't come out that shouldn't come out. And I think the other way that I think Arturo really mentioned was about the time aspect. So working on Slack, and we were all working in different time zones, by virtue of the delay that you have in those time zones, it actually gives you kind of time to kind of recover and recare, and you don't get kind of wrapped up in a frenetic emotional response that you might have otherwise. So in some ways, I really enjoyed that. I think the time zone aspect, we talk about it a lot in terms of that intensification of labour, but actually for me, it just felt like it was a gentler wave to ride in terms of self-care than us all being in the same time zone. Does that answer your question, or does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kat and Arturo. We're going to have to move on to our next speaker, but thank you again for a insightful presentation about some of the pitfalls of the choreography of self-organization, as you so beautifully put it, Kat. All right. Up next is Jess Adams. So I will hand the floor to you.
Awesome, thank you, Nick. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jess. I'm a PhD student at the University of East London. And what I want to talk about today is an experience that I had where I met the Queen, or you can see her full title up on my slide, but for quite obvious reasons, I won't read it out. Just to clarify, as with some of the others, this is a work in progress as well. So the very brief version of the story of meeting the Queen is that I was offered the opportunity and I kind of debated briefly if it was a good idea or not. Obviously, the Queen is the head of an empire that's caused huge amounts of destruction and devastation across the world. And as someone kind of claiming a militant research orientation, that kind of gave me pause for thought. But I did decide to go ahead with it. It is quite strange to be presenting on something and sharing something that's so sort of conflicted. And I feel a little bit embarrassed actually to share now the Instagram post from my personal account and my awful caption as kind of proof of this encounter. But my PhD is quite fundamentally a story of politicization. So I think it's useful to kind of look at this moment and to look at my decision making behind it, and to try and think about what it might tell us, not only about militant research, but also about organizing in academia more broadly. So as many of you will know, and as was actually raised in the kind of opening session, there is a very long history of feminists and others who work to trouble research in different ways. And the way that this is played out in my research and in this specific paper is about the kind of interplay of the affective registers of uncertainty, embarrassment, and shame in different forms. And what I want to specifically try and do is articulate those affective registers through Sara Ahmed's understanding of sweaty concepts. which I think can be read as an expression of antagonism, including in my reading of Sam Halvorson's take on militant research and the importance of antagonism within that. For me, all of this kind of comes together through the quite well-known figure of the killjoy, who kind of acts in this work as a locus for these debates. The killjoy is one of the subjective figures in my PhD research, and one of the questions I'm trying to answer with her is whether or not it's possible to kill the joy of my own research. But as well as being someone who kills joy, she's also transversal. She's hopeful, and in particular, she's uncertain. I think that there are some echoes here with diffraction from Karen Barad and other new materialists, and ideas as well around low or minor theory in terms of the way that this analysis works. Can I just check actually you can still hear me okay? I've got some drilling in the background.
We can hear you okay.
Okay, sweet. And so what I want to do is I want to work through 3 different kind of registers, which are failure, refusal, and fragility. And within that, there are 3 kind of other things that I'm thinking about, which is the kind of the bodily, the pedagogical, and the collective, which are kind of emerging as quite critical themes within my research. So to start with failure, within the literature on militant research, I've found Lara Coleman's work around the idea of sort of shuttling back and forth between critique as the academic and commitment as the organizer really useful. So to kind of shuttle back and forth using the killjoy to understand whether or not that decision was a failure. In the first instance, being the killjoy, categorically it was a failure. The Queen has presided over all this kind of devastation, and as a committed organizer, it was a bad call. And related to that, I think if it's about sort of if my research is in part about understanding bravery, then again, it would be a failure. I was not brave in this decision to meet the Queen. At the same time, if we kind of take the perspective of the transversal killjoy, I think she would perhaps ask a few more questions. I think if it's about understanding why people aren't brave, then maybe it's less of a failure. Obviously, what's really critical in this discussion is to pull apart the very idea of failure. And I really like the way that Nick Clear talks about the idea that we can't sanitize failure or discussions of failure through what he calls theoretical grandstanding. So I guess the question is, how do I sit with the blood that's on the Queen's hands and the sweat from that sweaty concept? I'm interested here in the bodily experience or affect of feeling and sitting with that shame. I have, of course, also been reading Jack Halberstam's work on failure, and that's really helped me to kind of read the uncertainty of this failure as, and I'm quoting, a more surprising way of being in the world. So somewhat related to this is a collective project that I've been inadvertently engaged in, which is about questioning this decision through informal conversations with friends, family, comrades, etc. And I think here there are links to the way that Foucault talks about caring for oneself. And so I think what that means is that you can start to see failure as an ongoing questioning, which is partly reliant on the initial bodily sensation of shame and embarrassment. And I guess where it kind of ends up for me is a way of seeing this failure as something to learn from, including collectively, but in a very, very uncertain form. So somewhat related to questions of failure are questions of refusal. And I need to be a bit more speculative here because obviously I didn't actually meet her. But I think it's useful to think about the concrete situations that refusal could operate within. So for Cindy Katz, refusal helps us to understand hegemony. And for Stephen Chukaitis, writing from an autonomous perspective, refusal is about refusing a subordinated politics of resistance. I am therefore wondering if perhaps my decision could be read as a refusal of the idea of refusal as resistance. Within this, if we are refusing refusal, I'm wondering if what might need to be at stake are the very subjectivities that we inhabit as militant researchers. Is this desire to move beyond those subjectivities a cop-out, as they say? Is this the theoretical grandstanding that I mentioned earlier? Maybe. But I want to quote from that infamous Do or Die pamphlet from 2005 and the essay in it, Give Up Activism, where they say, and I'm quoting, "The activist is a specialist or an expert in social change. Yet the harder we cling to this role and notion of what we are, the more we actually impede the change we desire." What sort of change could we foresee should the activist be more curious or more interested in complicity? or if the academic could be more firm and less interested in complicity. This is, of course, where the gap between critique and commitment is most keenly felt. And to be honest, I don't actually have the answers here completely, but I do want to ask the question. So some of these things I think come together, although not entirely, through ideas around fragility. And for Ahmed, fragility, as you can see here, is the wear and tear of living a feminist life. But in this understanding of fragility, I also want to bring in questions of strategy, and also related to that, questions of wisdom, which again partly comes from Shukaitis. I'm also here looking at Eve Tuck's work on desire, wisdom, and strategy. There's quite a famous article she wrote called Breaking Up with Deleuze, where she decolonizes Deleuze's desire. And I want to here tell a really quick story about one of my tupuna, or ancestors from Aotearoa or New Zealand. His name was Te Remini Te Kawa, and he had two quite significant encounters with the royals. The first was he was part of an official delegation to attend Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations here in the UK in 1897. And then a few years later, when the Duke and Duchess of York and Cornwall visited Aotearoa in 1901, Rimini commanded the Wairarapa Mounted Rifles, who had been selected as the royal couple's personal bodyguard. And apparently in that act, this brought a huge amount of prestige to local Māori. I'm trying here, as I said at the beginning, to work in a kind of diffractive register, something that's more suggestive and creative. And I actually don't have a huge amount of information about Rimini, but I am wondering if perhaps he was strategic and wise about the options that he had open to him. And within that, I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was also playing the game and prioritizing the possible gains that meeting the Queen could lead to. I guess what I'm really interested here in is the role of the collective pedagogy of my whakapapa or ancestry in terms of their wisdom and in terms of their strategic thinking. So I'm almost at the end, and I want to end with something of the big reveal. I think it will come as no surprise that I am, in fact, the transversal killjoy. And as the transversal killjoy, when I think about that decision, still I feel annoyed, but I also feel hopeful. And quite critically, I still am kind of on the fence as to whether or not it was a good decision. I think that through an attention to the bodily via the sweaty concepts, and with sitting with that discomfort of the blood on the Queen's hands, and also an attention to the pedagogical, so learning through those registers of failure and refusal and fragility, and without sanitizing that learning. And then finally, an attention to the collective by processing this experience with others, including, I hope, everyone here today, and attending to what could be sort of an ancestral strategy of playing the game. There's something uncertain that remains, and I think remains troubling in that feminist tradition. So at the very beginning, I suggested that this analysis might help us to understand something about organising in academia. And just to be really clear, the Queen could, of course, be anything that bothers us that's difficult. And fundamentally, the kind of very modest insight that I would like to offer as an expression of fragility, as per Natalie Blunk's quote on the previous slide, is that the sweaty concepts can't be sidelined. The sweaty concepts are bodily, pedagogical, and collective, but I think the most critical thing for me is the uncertainty and the modesty of these gestures, which I think is reflected in this quote from Tusa and Holdren's description of militant research. So then what does this mean for our organising in our academia? Cindy Katz says that working in a minor theoretical mode is to recognise that those subjectivities, spatialities, temporalities are embodied, situated and fluid. The production of knowledge inseparable from, if not completely absorbed in, the mess of everyday life. For me, the interest in these small and uncertain moments is just as useful as our theoretical grandstanding, particularly, I think, in terms of how we understand these quite critical questions of bravery and complicity and oppression. Thank you very much. And I've got some of my references on this final slide. Ooh.
Thank you so much, Jess, for a very provoking, thought-provoking and provocative presentation. Maybe we can explore some of those issues around conceptual sweatiness and feminist killjoys in question and answer session. So Is there anyone who would like to continue this dialogue? Kat, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, hi Jessica. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I loved it. I loved how you connected it to your ancestry as well. I thought that was fantastic. I was just wondering if you might want to talk a little bit more about the idea of surprise in your work. So, and I would say, you know, like hands up, I'm not aware of the kind of like the literature that you're coming off with, Stephen Shikaita. So it was more kind of I was thinking more from a kind of phenomenological point of view, because I know that you know, the idea of kind of waiting and the concept of surprise is really interesting from that perspective. So I'm thinking there's an article in Hypatia by Francoise Dastur, and she talks about the idea of surprise is both like a moment of facticity, like what you come to know, but also it's a moment of ontology in terms of where you actually come to re-know or know yourself. And it's that gap or that openness of possibility where like really interesting things happen. So this is my really long and probably sweaty way of saying, you know, did you feel surprised at how you felt at that moment? So what was the kind of, you talked about the kind of the openness that creates from a futurity point of view, but I was wondering, actually, you obviously knew what was going to happen and you obviously knew your politics as it happened. So what was the kind of, was there an aspect of surprise there, or was it something different? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the article sounds incredible. So please do. It'd be great if you could share it.
I will. I'll find it and I'll send it to you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a super interesting question. I have to confess I haven't spent loads of time thinking about like surprise as kind of an idea in and of itself, but I think there's loads of things that you said that resonate. To answer your question directly in terms of how it felt in the moment, if I'm honest, which I think is important, my politics have evolved a huge amount in the process of doing this PhD. So I think I said at the very beginning, it's been a process of politicization. I came into my research certainly with an interest in politics and kind of an affinity for certain types of organizing, predominantly from the arts actually, but have become more militant in this process of studying, which is great, I think. And so actually at that specific moment when I met the Queen, I did reflect initially when the opportunity was there, and it's probably worth saying that it was part of a weekend of events, and they didn't tell us that we would be meeting the Queen. So we arrived on a Friday night, and we kind of had this, you know, you'll be meeting her on Sunday, and so opting out was a bit different to kind of, you know, having weeks to kind of think about it and then choosing to go ahead with it. But anyway, that's not an excuse necessarily. But yeah, so I guess in terms of how I felt at the time, it was definitely. I think I was just caught up in it. And I think this is what I've tried to kind of reflect in the paper a little bit, like just that sense of being in this space with all of these other people who were really excited. You know, my emerging politics kind of got sidelined. And so I guess that's the thing that's been really interesting for me to reflect on, is that, you know, despite this kind of slow immersion in this kind of much more radical world, given the chance to meet the Queen, I still was like jumped at it and like was not super critical. So yeah, it's definitely something to think through, I think, a bit further.
Thanks for your question, Kat. I see another hand up.
No, thank you. That's good. I don't think the temporality aspects, I think that's really, sorry.
I think there's a bit of a delay, but Kat, do you want to finish your thought?
And thanks so much, but I don't think the temporality aspect, I think that's really important. It sounds like you were kind of blindsided into it. So I think that's really important, because when you don't have time, it's quite easy to be seduced into the normative, right? So yes, that's all I was going to say. But I'll sorry, Nick.
All right, thanks a lot. Let's take another question then from Matthew. I see your hand is raised.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I've also got bad connection, and yeah, there was a lot of new kind of concepts and ideas in that paper for me. So I was sometimes struggling to keep up. So apologies if I missed this, but the impression I got was you were talking about research broadly, and the kind of some kind of ramifications for different types of research, different methodologies. Does your argument, or does your kind of thinking extend to other areas of life, everyday life? Does it have kind of broader implications for how we live? Or are you thinking, am I right in thinking at least the paper was kind of focused on research methodologies? And if I am right in that, does it have kind of implications for other areas of life?
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Matthew. Another good question. I think, definitely, helping to think about research, but I think maybe not so much in terms, I guess the other thing that I'm finding quite interesting is thinking as kind of quite a newly politicized organizer, is obviously it has huge benefit, I guess, in terms of thinking about how we bring people into organizing spaces. And I think the fact that, there's been so much kind of soul searching over this particular moment, and, just thinking about all the conversations that I've had with different kind of collaborators that I work with on different projects. Now, like, it's been surprising how much, like, there's some people that I didn't lie, but I kind of stretched the truth a bit when I was talking to them about it, because I was like, there was one person I can think of in particular who's actually using a militant research methodology as well. And for some reason, when I spoke to him, I said, oh yeah, I did it, but I immediately regretted it. And I was like, no, I didn't. I didn't actually regret that. But there was like that pressure in that situation because I know his politics, and I found myself kind of like, just ascribing to, I guess, what I thought he wanted to hear. Which I think is really, depending on your very broad view of kind of social movements and the role that they play, like, I would argue that figuring out ways to bring people in is critical. But if we're creating spaces where people feel like they need to kind of not be their whole selves, that's also really problematic as well. So I guess that's something else that's kind of like, I don't have answers to that fully, but it's kind of resonating and sort of rattling around in my head as I go through.
Justina.
Hi, thanks for an amazing presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have just two quick thoughts that maybe you will have something to say too. The first thing is just picking up on the temporality thing. I also think it would be amazing to read through what you did with attention to different temporalities, like Kat suggested the condensed, or you yourself suggested the condensed temporality of, enthusiasm of meeting the Queen in a community just 2 days before it will happen, and then the much longer sort of intergenerational anxiety you inherited through your ancestors. And I know, of course, this will be a little bit speculative because you don't know a lot about them, but still, maybe there's something about, reading through the different temporalities and also looking into a bit the concept of intergenerational haunting, Grace Cho's work, and how there may be certain anxieties that resonate through generations. So that's the only one thing. The other thing I was thinking about is that what I really liked also in your story is that we all meet the Queen every day. I mean, buying a cup of coffee is an encounter with colonialism. Submitting your paper for a high-ranked journal is also, or worrying about, stuff like that is also meeting the Queen. And that's why I think your story is really important. And I was wondering how do we get close to the question of whether, I sense somehow that whether or not you should have met her is perhaps, that's a great question, but there may also be other questions that will allow us to come back to that question. So maybe you could ask more into sort of how to meet, or what does it do to us to meet, or is there other ways of getting closer to that question of whether it's correct or morally right or politically right to meet the Queen, by asking lots of other questions about how and what it does to us, and you know, what were the affects, what were the subject positions available, whatever sort of theoretical repertoire you want to use.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Both of them, I think, yeah, the temporality one is particularly interesting. I think particularly in the process of, you know, writing a PhD, just the very process of that, where you're trying to kind of think quite quickly in some ways about, you know, if you're using a militant research methodology, about experiences you're having then and there. And so you don't always have that sort of space for critical reflection that, you know, you maybe would if you were doing a slightly different looking research project. And yeah, I completely agree with you as to whether or not that is the right question. So it'll be fun to sit down and sort of pose some different ones to that situation and to the kind of wider context in which I'm working, I guess, in which we're all working, as you say, in relation to colonialism and its kind of ongoing legacies. So thank you.
Thanks.
We have time for one more question, if there's anyone who wishes to chip in. Well, if not, I actually have one. I also enjoyed your presentation immensely. I thought it was very unusual, unconventional in a really good way. And like Justina, I also appreciated the way, maybe I was reading into it, but I felt like your meeting with the Queen was a way of dramatizing and accelerating the everyday kind of dilemmas and compromises that we all face in our private lives and our working lives, perhaps on the highest level in British society and in the Commonwealth. But my question really is about something else, which is the relationship really between the killjoy and the comedian, for want of a better word. So the killjoy, the feminist killjoy in particular, is someone who kills other people's joy, who deprives men and women of pleasure. And typically this pleasure has a lot to do with humor, with laughter. And so I wonder where you place your slightly humorous, sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek Instagram post, and how you kind of relate yourself to the figure of the killjoy, as well as the figure of the comedian, everyday comedian. Is that something that you've thought much about?
I haven't. Is it too much of a cop-out to say that as someone who grew up in New Zealand, being sarcastic is kind of baked into us? It's a really good question again, and really interesting. I don't think about humour that often, I guess, and maybe I should, because it is obviously a really profound coping mechanism to deal with, you know, particularly emotions or affects like kind of shame and embarrassment. You know, if you can make a joke out of something, you're then sort of on the you've got the upper hand in relation to that situation, which is quite interesting to think through. So yeah, no, I hadn't thought about it before, but I look forward again to spending some time thinking about it. Thank you.
All right, then let us thank Jess once again for your presentation. Really appreciated it. And then we can move on to the final presentation of this session. Eva, you have the floor.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, I've been really quiet today for numerous reasons, but also perhaps because it's been a while since I've been in touch with organizational scholars. So I am an organizational scholar myself, but for the past, 4 years almost, I have been doing my postdoc project with the degrowth movement and with the citizen movements, and it's been really great. But now I'm approaching a time where I want to report of my study, and this is my first attempt with the organizational scholars, sort of explaining what I've been doing, right? So I've been also trying to listen a lot, what's up with everybody. I have prepared a presentation and I will show the slides because it might help you to focus on what I have been doing. And I have some challenges beyond what I just said. But I think we can discuss about this towards the end. But I just wanted to say that it was not easy to prepare this because this has a lot of topics. So I'm talking today about, let me just see how I can do the sharing. So I'm talking about forest issues, which is not very, which is something that I didn't sort of, I chose to do it, but not intentionally, so to speak. But let me see, I will just try to figure out how do I do this. All right. Okay, can you see a presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Okay, so this is the topic. I'm talking about forest dialogues, active citizens, and after talking with forest scholars, so these are mostly social scientists working with forest topics, they helped me to focus my work on active citizens who try to navigate institutionalized and highly polarized landscapes. So as I said, I have a project. It's funded by foundations. In Finland, we have this peculiar system where postdocs can have independent funding and affiliation to universities. And here are some of my affiliations. So when I defended my dissertation, that was with the management department in Aalto, but I have been affiliated with the Department of Design due to sustainable design research matters. So that's the explanation for that. And I am with the degrowth movement as well. So forest came as a topic through my fieldwork in about the time when I started my postdoc project. And it's a very peculiar topic because I have born and I have been raised in the forest almost, although in a city. But Finland is mostly forest, so we're covered with a lot of forest, and it approximates about 10% of European forests in total. So that's quite remarkable in terms of contemporary socio-ecological challenges, because forests have a role in carbon sink issues, in bioeconomy matters and so forth. So it's a very contested topic. Biodiversity issues as well. And approximately 10% of Finnish forests are conserved. And this all relates to what I'm sort of about to speak. And there is in Finland about 500,000 private forest owners. And all of this information I have sort of gathered throughout the years. So I haven't sort of realized much of this information before getting in touch with this topic. I will actually, well, yes. So I just wanted to also show that also the state owns a lot of forest in Finland, so approximately 30%, in addition to private people and companies. And majority of the forest owners are men, and quite old men. So average age of 62. So this could also explain why I haven't much encountered the issue of forest or forest ownership. It is something that we see in the news with the forest companies and how they are doing in the stock market. But with when it comes to political analysis and economy, then forest has been quite hidden also from me as an organizational scholar and a degrowth activist before I got into this topic. And now I have said it so many times. I should have started with this, but then slides were already prepared in another logic. So I got involved with forest discussions in a degrowth event some years ago in 2016, because I attended a workshop in forest. And this was mostly the only reason I attended the workshop, because it was outdoors. But it was a very touching workshop in terms of content, because we were exploring our relationship to the actual forest that we were in, but also what ramifications does this kind of direct relationship have against our concerns about ecological crisis and social injustices. And year after that event, there was another degrowth event when actually we decided to do something about the issue. And the problem that we identified was that there's a huge gap. So everything I showed earlier about the figures of forest, the owners of forest, this seems to be like a world of its own. And when it comes to regular citizens, like even organizational scholars like me, they don't seem to know what's going on, especially if they're in the urban areas. There is a really lively public debate, but that emerged, I think, again, around the time that I got also involved with this work, or maybe I just paid more attention to it. So we formed a group of active people. We refer, or some of the people in the group refer to themselves as citizens, something that we can discuss also today. And this was the sort of main event that all forest-related people were invited, like organizations were invited to join. It was a very, very big event. Some public protesting, I guess, or trying to impact the decision makers about the importance of forests, or this is in Helsinki in front of governmental buildings and the parliament building. So this movement that I got involved is called Our Forest, or Meidän metsämme in Finnish. And it is unregistered, so it's not like any entity officially, but it's, of course, it has its own organization. And there's about 5 to 10 active people in coordination group based on voluntary work. And my role in this has been with the communications, with organizing activities, supporting institutionally this work. And perhaps half of the people are from the degrowth movement, and then there are people from forest active citizens who have been dealing with forests longer. So they are ecologists, biologists, or conservation organization people. But it's still considered quite weird as an organization. So it's not a nature conservation group, but it's not like a forest industry related group. So it's something new, perhaps, and hopeful in terms of the very locked in forest debates in Finland. And now we focus on these forest dialogues that I promised to present here today a bit. And here is one of the struggles that I have when talking with you as organizational scholars, because I think we could talk about so many things already about how this movement is organized and what happens with people when they come together for meetings, let alone my role as a scholar and activist with this group. But nevertheless, I will talk about the content as well. So we have organized this so-called forest dialogues, and it was the original aim in the forest outdoors workshop in the first place to bring together people who would not necessarily meet otherwise so they could understand each other better, because there was a concern that people in the degrowth movement in that particular workshop, we were, well, they at the time, because I was completely out of everything at the time, they were sort of asking, what do these people think when they conduct these decisions about forest industry investments and clear cuttings and forest products and so forth. Like they seem to be very distant. And then there was a wish to speak to the company representatives, and it was actually achieved this year. So there was a dialogue that I'm showing here, the dates. The very last two are about forest and the industry. And there has been a bit more than 10, depending if there is this open dialogue that we organized as well. But all of the dialogues otherwise have been invitational and closed. So they have not been documented beyond photos from the participants. And then some summaries given outside the dialogues. I'm just seeing what I put here.
Eva, just to let you know, you have 3 or so minutes left.
Yes, thanks. So what I'm trying to communicate to you is that these are quite unique as events. So there are people from the ministry coming together with people from like a regular forest owner who might never meet otherwise. So it is really a facilitated space for people to come and meet other people that they would normally meet. And during the COVID pandemic, we have met outdoors. So this is an image of one of the outdoor meetings. And there's always a visit to the forest and so forth. And there's this rule. So why I can talk about this is that in every dialogue, we have agreed that people can talk about what was said about it, but not who said it. So this is one rule in some dialogues. So, of course, I have the material of the entire coordination working group work and email lists and the activities that I have been observing and doing. But concerning the dialogues, I have participated in 4 dialogues and facilitated 1 dialogue because the main facilitator was unable to come. And at the moment, I'm just trying to gather my materials together. So, and here's one, this is also in the paper, so let's not go into this with this time, but this is just to show the complexity of the forest debates in Finland. There are these talks about themes such as sustainability, forest ownership, and there are arguments and counter-arguments, arguments and counter-arguments. And then when it almost feels like when a person runs out of good arguments, they shift to another circle. So somebody might be talking about well-being and biodiversity when the other person goes and starts to talk about carbon sinks. And this is a very visible thing in the public debate, but also in some of the dialogues. These are also in the paper, so I won't go in here. So what I find that might be relevant to organizational scholars or not, let's discuss this. These are still very forest-based, these themes or ideas that I have been thinking, is that I think that there is a lot about ownership issues. And this is, of course, a very political matter. And there is the slogan that forest owners decide, which is very becoming contested in the times of ecological crisis. Then I think our forest movement is trying to build capacity of forest literacy instead of only the so-called objective forest knowledge. Yes, and nobody has disagreed with my interpretation, but let's see if this is how we can work with this. And then I'm a diverse economy scholar, so community economies is one of my home bases. So this is also something that I would like to explore. What would be diverse forest ownership, for example? So I'm curious to hear what resonates with you about this, what I've been talking briefly today, and if you have something, concepts or thoughts that could help me with the organizational scholarship stuff, I would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva, for your presentation. And I think there's a lot there that resonates with both of the previous presentations in terms of forging new types of activism, new types of dialogue, some of the pitfalls and problems that you might encounter, as well as, of course, encountering those, meeting those, trying to establish contact with those who might not necessarily share our views and may in fact be diametrically opposed. So it's kind of meeting the queen in a forest situation in many respects. So hopefully we can explore some of the issues that you raise, Eva, in the question and answer session. So is there anyone who wants to make a comment, ask a question? Let's take, we have 3 hands going up. I think Ozan, you were in there first. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Eva. As an organization scholar who also affiliated with diverse economies and also critical organization studies, there are too many things that also took my attention, alternative forms of organizing, and also, but my main question is there any way that you can contest the notion of ownership here? Because I know that in some different countries that there are ownership models based on trust. So it's not like the state, it's not like the private, it's sort of private ownership, but for the sake of the community, or for the good of the community. So I wonder, is there any way that you can contest the current ownership structure and offer an alternative ownership model where you can actually, build a new model there? Or are there any attempts? Perhaps there might be some alliances with these kind of other movements. So just some questions and comments.
Do you want me to comment immediately? How should we proceed?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yes, there are, for instance, in the surveys concerning forests and forest ownership, the people conducting the surveys might say that we excluded the alternative ownership from these. And then I'm like, so what is the alternative ownership? So this is people who form, for instance, an association and buy forests together, or it's foundations who buy forests together. So there seems to be this very, like, it's status quo that we just exclude these people. It's not much, like percentage-wise, it's not much from the ownership. But I think there is something at least. And that would be one, I think, institutional goal to say that, okay, so should we at least survey these people and include them?
Thank you.
Jess, I think you had a question.
Yeah, just a quick and quite practical one. Thanks for your paper. You mentioned something about whether or not your findings might be of interest to, organizational studies people, etc. But I was also wondering, like, how you're thinking about the role of your research within the community that you're working, and whether or not your findings are kind of being shared with them, and how, and kind of what that relationship sort of looks like.
Yes, thanks. So far we have done so that the meeting, we have very scarce meeting time with the coordination group, but I have tried to squeeze in during this year, like always a point that, okay, I'm working on now this the paper I have been working this spring. So I'm working on this paper now, and I'm thinking about this matter. So what's your perspective on this? And I have noticed that throughout the process, it's been really so organic in a way. What my role is to sometimes to bring on more these analytical perspectives with the people, but when it comes to organizing and like what benefits the work, it is actually the hands that do the work, who call the people, who organize coffee, who send the email out, and so forth. So this is the type of work that gets to be done, and this is what I have, of course, done all the time. But I just wanted to say that it's interesting, though, to think because it's very like people have a very similar view what should be done and how it should be done. So it's very interesting, where does this vision come from? Because we don't seem to explicitly speak like, okay, let's have a vision workshop, but it just sort of emerges that let's contact these people and let's not contact them. They might not be now relevant, and let's do it this way. And yeah, so there's very rarely fights or conflicts about how to proceed.
Justina.
If Arturo wants to go first, that's also fine with me. Okay.
No, I'm okay with you. You were called first, so please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Eva, for this amazing presentation. It opens a range of different and super interesting questions, and I am somehow stuck in a corner of of what you are doing. So maybe yeah, bear with me if my comment or question is a bit marginal to what you want to do. But I was thinking about sort of how to speak on behalf of forests around that question, and I was also thinking about when you had your slides on arguments and the sort of the content of the argument. I was also thinking about sort of the type of knowledge that can speak on behalf of forests. And there's a tendency, of course, often to make numeric arguments. We are losing so and so much forest. Forests contribute with so and so much to our economy and whatever. So I'm also now linking back to a Ephemera conference we had a few years ago in Stockholm, which was called Beyond Measure. But it's a really open question around, did you run into these sort of different manners of making arguments? Did you also find that numbers are often used strategically and sometimes efficiently, but that there are also other types of knowledge? You know, what does it mean to be in a forest? There's a lot of ways of experiencing forest that can't be made into numbers. And are these arguments also valuable, or should we strategically, yeah, just to come to the idea about numbers?
Yes, thank you. And yes, absolutely. This is what happens. and some people talk in cubic meters. So when they talk about forest, they talk about how many cubic meters of logs they see. Whereas others, when they talk about forest, like the ecologists, they say the mycelium network or the mushrooms, and it's very different. And implicitly, what I think our forests is trying to do is, and also explicitly, is trying to advocate for making other types of knowing also more valuable. People in the group, some people talk about emotions and affections as a source of knowledge. So, and that was what the original workshop was about, the grief. Like, do these people with power realize how much grief people have when they because they cannot impact. It's a very concrete problem. One can own their whatever property or live on a property. There's forest next to it, but whoever owns it, they don't have to announce anything. They can just clear cut everything. And you might, but because of the laws in Finland, you can visit everybody's forest. So it might be a very dear forest to you. You might go pick berries and do whatever, and then, you know, out of nowhere, it's just gone. And people report these shocks because they lose something, and then they might get this. Yeah. So this is and this is ignored a lot, these types of knowledges and feelings, I think. But it's of course one, like there's so much others. Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Arturo, you have the last question.
Perfect, thank you. And I want to thank Nick to put me after Justina, because my question is a natural segue that I was trying to craft. So serendipity to my favor. So when I was hearing your presentation, there were a couple of things that came into my mind, and I was listening at the same time at a global and at a local level. And I think that is something that is true to me, because when I'm looking at the global level, I'm thinking on how do we conceptualize forest of public spaces. And I can think on 3 different ways that I've seen in the news. And I do this because some of the work that I do independently. For example, in Colombia, in 2018, they granted personhood to the rainforest. So they identify it as a living being that is independent from. And it has legally, and one of the implications is like, if, for example, you contaminated a river or you clean a space of it, you are committing murder. So granting personhood, now you are in a criminal space. So that is one side of it. There's other conversation of ownership in the US, where nature can be seen as a public utility. Therefore, we have national parks that they are government-sponsored reservations of nature. And we have, and that is a global model that is being used by the United Nations. The other conversation that I'm hearing is about economic exploitation. And in that space is what you were mentioning, like how many metric tons of wood you get, but it's linked to conversations of sink carbon, like how much will it cost me to buy your right to contaminate? So that is the different conversation. And the last conversation that I heard, and that was as well something that Justina mentioned about the well-being. In Japan, there is something that is called some forest bathing, as in taking a bath in the forest. And there are medical studies that says that this is true and exists. So you go to the physician, and the physician writes you a prescription to spend certain amount of time in a forest. That means that preserving nature and forest is a concept of public health that involves the medical system. So there are multiple conversations, and the theme of how you want to get there, the methods to get there, get involved into how you value whatever you define there. So yes, perhaps a comparative conversation where you talk different elements will be an ultimate value for organizations, where we recognize that there are cultural embedded attempts and there are different values that they are linked to the space, but they have a global reach and they may repeat themselves.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. I'm grateful for all the comments because yes, as you must know, being in a context for a long time, it just gets really myopic. Is that a word? Like really sort of not seeing anything.
Not seeing the wood from the trees, as it were.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks once again, Eva, for your presentation, for introducing us to these forest dialogues. And let me, of course, thank our other presenters for this afternoon and for the discussions that we've been having. around them. So we now have a 13-minute break. We'll reconvene at 4 p.m. for the closing session. Ozan, do you want to say a few words about the link for this session?
That's a good idea, actually. I thought everyone has access, but it's a good idea to share the link. I can share it on chat, so it's the closing panel, so everyone is invited. Just give me a minute. Yes, I copied it in chat. And we will be there, yeah, in 10 minutes, 30 minutes.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and see you in a bit.
Thanks for sharing, Nick.